Hello, and welcome to the Quantum Fit Podcast. I'm Taylor, and I am your host. This podcast is all about applying the different principles of quantum physics and quantum biology to your health and fitness. This gives us a holistic view of how different environmental factors, such as sunlight or cold, play a major role in your overall health. So I won't just be talking about diet or exercise and developing good habits. If you want to really make lasting changes in how you feel, think, and act, then I'd recommend you try to listen closely and have an open mind to what I have to say. Every day I'll be hitting you with a quick 7 to 15 minute long podcast. I keep it short like this because it makes it both informative and to the point so that you don't feel quite so overwhelmed with information. Also, currently I do not do any kind of advertisements. So instead, I ask that you share this podcast with a friend or family member if you enjoyed the message and gained something from it. I want to be able to spread quality and easy to understand content that everyone can take and use in their own daily lives. I would highly appreciate it. On to today's episode, Understanding Leptin Resistance. Before going into any specific science, you need to understand that leptin is the master hormone for energy metabolism. It determines whether the products of fats and carbohydrates you eat will actually make it and be accepted into your cells. If you are leptin resistant, it is impossible for tissues to get optimal amounts of fuel from the liver. The tissues become energy starved, even if you have a ton of fat on your body. This means poorly functioning tissues and chronic fatigue. An extreme example of this would be, someone who's very overweight. I'm sure you've seen it before. If they're going up a flight of stairs, for instance, they get wiped out super, super quickly. They just can't do it, especially if they're going up a couple flights. They'll actually have to pause and catch their breath. It's because their muscle tissue is, again, literally energy starved. It's running off minimal baseline amounts of energy, fuel. And it's because they're leptin resistant. Same goes for people that are extremely, extremely skinny, not necessarily anorexic, but also people that are legitimately anorexic. They're also leptin resistant, and they face that same issue where they're energy starved in their, and so they get the same kind of chronic fatigue issues. But if you're leptin sensitive, like extremely leptin sensitive, you could basically keep eating and eating without ever putting on any fat. Assuming you're not eating many carbs, especially fructose. Fructose is a killer. And the calories mostly come from animal products, specifically seafood. Being leptin sensitive ensures that any fuel not safely stored in the liver will be burned off in other tissues, mostly muscle and brown fat, through the uncoupling proteins. Again, this is important here, the uncoupling proteins, because, if you try to burn off a lot of fat or if you try to burn through a lot of energy using the mitochondria, just making ATP, generating ATP from fuel, it does burn calories, but it also generates a lot of stress, a lot of reactive oxygen species. Whereas using uncoupling proteins allows you to burn off a ton of fuel and just turn it into heat, like straight heat. So there's no damage that happens. There's no inflammation, no reactive oxygen species that way. And you need to be leptin sensitive in order to activate those uncoupling proteins. Also, it seems that remaining leptin sensitive over time will vastly improve the efficiency of uncoupling proteins. Kind of a side note that's kind of interesting is the uncoupling proteins can actually become so efficient in, well, athletes especially, where at first the amount of uncoupling proteins will increase, but over time with training, uncoupling proteins will actually decrease, even though they have the same capacity or better capacity to burn off, burn off fuel, my bad, not carbs, fuel through the uncoupling proteins. I don't know, it's kind of interesting. Anyway, this is all, again, assuming you're eating according, to your environment and not having a ton of carbs, because that is pretty key to, carbs, lots and lots of carbs. That's going to make you leptin resistant, and it'll make you inflamed. So where does leptin come from? It's made from white adipose tissues, the jiggly fat on your body. The more fat you have, the more leptin you produce. So this again signifies that leptin is the hormone of energy metabolism. It's a very, very useful tool. Your brain is able to keep track of how much body you have through leptin receptors in the hypothalamus. This gives the brain a perfect measure of how much fat you have, based on how much leptin is, getting received, how strong the signal is basically in the hypothalamus. And then the brain will just change your metabolism accordingly based on what season you're in and how many pounds you're packing. I mean, again, this is assuming you are, in fact, sensitive to the leptin signal and you're getting outside in your environment often enough. So let's take an example of someone who eats the standard American diet but is still in their young 20s. They're by no means skinny, but they're not too big either. Let's also assume that they don't have a whole lot of complaints, maybe some fatigue and minor sleep issues. Well, because they're eating this way, again, lots of fructose, we're getting lots of fried oils, just a lot of shit is what they're eating, basically. We can guarantee that they're well on their way to becoming leptin resistant. If they continue eating this way, we can guarantee that they will become fully leptin resistant. The question, of course, is what happens after that? Well, as we put on more fat, this means that there will become more and more leptin. Leptin is extremely inflammatory in large amounts. After being in this state for long enough, our person in this example will develop insulin resistance. Leptin actually destroys a protein called amylin that is secreted by the beta cells of the pancreas, the same cells that release insulin. And what this does over time is cause the beta cells to stop producing insulin. The beta cells, basically just shut off. And voila, type 2 diabetes. Or if it happens really, really, really fast, there's actually a type 1.5 diabetes that's way worse than type 2 diabetes. Now, continuing on, no longer being able to control blood sugar levels and, still having crazy high leptin levels, it's going to leave our poor individual very inflammatory and very stressed. This, of course, means that cortisol levels are going to go through the roof. The next train wreck coming is adrenal resistance, where the adrenal glands stop being able to produce many hormones besides cortisol. Basically, cortisol ends up taking up all of the precursors that actually build all of the really main essential hormones. Things like DHEA and testosterone, for instance. Instead, all hormone production gets shifted strictly to cortisol. Now, we could keep going further along on this, again, this train wreck, but this is the point where chronic diseases, will have taken hold already. Things like cancer and degeneration of different tissues. Because again, at this point we have high levels of leptin, extremely high blood sugar levels, or blood sugar that just keeps bouncing all over the place. Both of those in of themselves, extremely, extremely inflammatory. Cortisol, extremely inflammatory. There's a whole bunch of other really, really nasty things that'll be going on too, like tumor necrosis factor. That is not a fun protein to have large amounts of. But I will get. We're kind of getting a little longer than I wanted, so I'll have to do another episode or two that dives a little bit deeper on the specifics that I've talked about. So anyway, if you have any questions and comments, you can find me on Instagram at RealQuantumFit, the Quantum Fit Facebook page, my personal Facebook page, Taylor Kelson, or you can send me a voice message across the Anchor app. See ya!